Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. I've been away for a while because I had to take care of some health issues, but your girl is back. Yes. And in today's video, we're going to learn about the foundations of prototypal inheritance in JavaScript. And we're also going to see how some of the built-in objects inherit properties and methods from Object.prototype. And my goal for this video is that at the end, you would understand what prototypes are and how objects in JavaScript are linked via what we call the prototype chain. I'll also be translating a lot of or explaining a lot of abstractions with illustrations to help you understand better and build the right mental model around inheritance in JavaScript. Let's get to it. For real. Inheritance in JavaScript is prototype based, and it is widely known as prototypal inheritance because it involves the concept of prototype chaining. Now, prototype chaining refers to the linking of objects via the prototype internal slot, and I'll talk about this internal slot in a minute. But as we know, an object in JavaScript is a collection of properties, and a property is an association between a key and a value. So objects in JavaScript can be created in different ways, right? The basic way is to use the literal syntax. But objects can also be created using constructors, and a constructor is like a blueprint or a factory for creating objects of the same type. So constructors are basically regular function objects that also supports JavaScript's internal construct method, right? They can be used to create or construct other objects, basically. Functions in JavaScript can be called function objects. They're really ordinary objects, which means they can have properties and methods, but they also support JavaScript's internal call method, right? So they are callable objects. Every constructor must support JavaScript's call and construct internal methods, right? But not every function can be used as a constructor, and functions that cannot be used as constructors do not support JavaScript's construct internal method. And arrow functions cannot be used as constructors. They cannot be used to make other objects. When an object is created using a constructor, that object is said to be an instance of that constructor. And an object can be created using a constructor by adding the keyword new to the function call. So with the keyword new, you can create as many instances of a function or a constructor that you define, or one of JavaScript's built-in object types that is a constructor function. So here we have a function called dog, and dog has an age property on it. We can use dog as a constructor by adding the keyword new to the function call and assigning it to a variable. So we can simply say let bingo new dog. We're using dog as a constructor here, and calling our dog function with a new keyword creates a brand new object, right? It also creates a new execution context that has a this keyword defined to it. So this here will be pointing to the new object, and then it will add these properties, or this property, we have just one here, it will add this property to the new object. And since the function is not returning anything, it will return the new object we just created and assign it to the variable bingo here. So if we console log bingo dot age and save, we'll get 2, right? So we can create as many instances of this our dog function here as we want by adding new to the function call. JavaScript has some standard built-in objects and built-in constructors. Well, the constructors are built-in objects, but I'm separating them and saying built-in constructors and built-in objects because I'm also going to talk about some built-in objects that are not constructors, right? So if I just open this, come on. So we have the capital O objects, capital O object. We have the function object, we have the boolean object, we have number object, we have so the array object, and the rest of them, right? So these are fundamental objects that are built into the language, and they can be used as constructors when you put the new keyword in front of them, or when you call the function, when you call them with the new keyword. Now they behave differently when you just call them without the new keyword. But if you want to use them as constructors, you have to put the new keyword in front of them. Yes. So we can call them built-in constructor function objects, right? But for the sake of this video, I'm going to be calling them constructor function objects, because I can't be saying built-in constructor function object. No, that's a mouthful. I'll call them constructor functions, or the built-in constructor functions. So these built-in constructor functions they each have a special property known as prototype, right? And this prototype is what is used to implement prototype-based inheritance. Let's back up a bit. All functions in JavaScript except arrow functions, all functions by default has this prototype property, and it is only available on functions. Now the value of this prototype property is a prototype object. All functions have a prototype property except arrow functions. All functions have this prototype property, and its value points to a prototype object, right? I need to explain this the way I understand it, so I'm going to use our dog function here as an example before I go back to talking about the built-ins. When you declare a function, something else happens that is not very obvious. An empty object gets created and set as the initial value of that function's prototype property. Remember, I said all functions have this special property, this special prototype property. So if you declare a function, another empty object gets created and set as the initial value of that function's prototype property. Let's take our dog example here, or let's use our dog as an example. So when we declared our dog function, right, let's say this is our dog function, something else happens. Another object gets created. This is the object. Internally, you don't see it. So this object is currently empty, and this object is referred to as dog's prototype object, right? Remember I said functions, except arrow functions, have a special property called prototype. This is it. This is the special property, and this prototype property points to this object that gets created when you declare the function, right? Forget about this prototype internal slot here in square brackets. I'll explain what they are later. But this prototype object is the object that gets created internally when we defined or when we declared our dog function, and it is called dog's prototype object. It is called dog.prototype. If our function is called, if we name our function iforma, the object will be iforma.prototype. So that's how it gets its name. Now, whatever method, whatever property we want to be available to all instances of dog, whatever method or property we want to be available to them, or we want them to have access to, we'll need to define it here. So for now it's empty, right? But if we want to add a bark, or let us add a bark method to this dog's prototype object, we can simply say it is convention to capitalize constructor function names. Dog.prototype.bark is the method we want to add. For example, let's just assign a string, say woof. Yeah. So we're defining this bark method on dog's prototype. Bingo will have access to it because Bingo is an instance of dog. Now if we decide to call this property on Bingo, log bingo.bark, would get wolf. Yes. Now, if we have 10 or a million dog instances and we want all of them to have this same bark functionality, By defining it in dog's prototype object here, they can all have access to it, and this is more memory efficient, because we're not creating a back property for every single dog instances. They can all share and have access to this one, so it will be in memory just once. How does Bingo have access to this back property that we define on dog's prototype property? Right? Because Bingo doesn't own it. We did not define a back property on Bingo itself. This is where inheritance comes in. And like I said earlier, inheritance in JavaScript uses the concept of prototype chaining. And this refers to linking of objects via the prototype internal slot. I will still explain what this prototype internal slot is in a bit. But when a constructor creates an object, like Bingo was created from our dog function here, right? It creates that object linked to its prototype property, right? So what is the value of dog's prototype property here? It's its prototype object. So Bingo and every other instance created from dog will be implicitly linked to this prototype property. This is an explicit link because this is its prototype object. But Bingo and every other instance of dog will be implicitly linked to this prototype, to dog's prototype object. Now, this prototype object also has where it is linked to, and we're going to see that in a bit, right? But Bingo's prototype is dog.prototype because Bingo is an instance of dog. To find out what the prototype of an object is, we can use the getPrototypeOf method, and this is the method that is defined on Object.prototype, and we're going to see what Object.prototype is in a minute. But to find out what Bingo's prototype is, we can simply say object, capital O, dot get prototype, objects.getPrototypeOf, and then we pass Bingo in and save. If we refresh, we'll get an object that has this bark method. You can see we log to the console Bingo's prototype. We're trying to find out what Bingo's prototype is, and here we're seeing an object that has a bark method. We defined this bark method in dog's prototype object. So dog's prototype object is Bingo's prototype. So what happens when we try to access this bark property on Bingo is that JavaScript checks to see if it will find the bark property on Bingo, on the Bingo object itself. And of course, if it finds it, it will return the value. But it won't because we didn't define the back property on Bingo. So it will move up the prototype chain to Bingo's prototype. And what is Bingo's prototype? Bingo's prototype is dog.prototype, right? And we defined it there, so it will find it. But if dog's prototype object did not have this bark property, JavaScript will move up the prototype chain again. Now, each link in the prototype chain will be walked through one link at a time until it finds a matching property name, or the link gets terminated when it gets to Object.prototype. Because Object.prototype serves as the final link on the prototype chain, it has null as its own prototype. So JavaScript checks Bingo to see if Bingo has the back property. It doesn't find it, it moves on to dog. We defined it on dog, so it finds it there. If it doesn't find it on dog, it moves to Object.prototype. If it doesn't find Object.prototype, from that operation, undefined will be returned because Object.prototype serves as the final link on the prototype chain. This is basically how the prototype chain works, and Bingo will have access to this bark method. Even though it's not its own, it will have access to it because that bark method is on its prototype chain. Now we can call, I will talk about Object.prototype in a minute, but Object.prototype contains methods like toString, value of, Even the get prototype of we just use now is contained on Object.prototype, and Bingo will have access to all these methods because these methods are available on its own prototype chain. It doesn't need to have that method directly. It doesn't need to own that method. Now I'll come back to Bingo and dog here, but I need us to go back to the built-in constructors that I was talking about before. So we're going to look at the built-in constructors and their own prototype objects. Yes, the built-in constructors also have their own prototype objects, the same way dog has its own prototype object. But the thing is, these prototype objects cannot be used as constructors because they're just objects. Constructors have to be functions. So in JavaScript, we have the capital O object, the object, right? It is one of the fundamental objects built into the language, and it also has a prototype property because it can be used as a constructor. I explained that before. It has a prototype property that points to Object.prototype. Object.prototype is also a built-in object. It's built into the language, but it is a prototype object, so it's just an object. It cannot be used as a constructor. Object has a prototype property that points to Object.prototype, and Object.prototype sits at the top of the prototype chain. So it contains methods like toString, value of, has on property, and the rest of them. And all other objects, all other built-in objects inherit from Object.prototype. Just like we saw how Bingo's prototype chain, Object.prototype is the final link on the prototype chain, right? We saw how Bingo's prototype chain got all the way to Object.prototype. So we also have the built-in function object, right? And the built-in function object has a prototype property because it is a function. It has a prototype property that points to its own prototype object, which is function.prototype. And function.prototype contains methods like .call, .bind, .apply, and the rest of them. Now there are other built-in function objects that can be used as constructors in the language, like the built-in string object, the string object, not the primitive string, the number objects, the date objects, and they also have their own prototype object, but I will not be adding them here because we don't have space. Lastly, I'm going to be adding the array object, right? And it also has a prototype property that points to its prototype object, which is array.prototype. And array.prototype has methods like .pop, push, splice, and all the other awesome array methods. So these objects, these prototype objects are objects. They cannot be used as constructor functions, right? Now another thing I would like to add is that every object in JavaScript has a prototype internal slot, and this internal slot corresponds to the internal state associated with objects, right? Now the value of this internal slot, or the internal slot, generally links to another object. It references or links to another object, and whatever it links to is known as its value. Whatever it links to is its value, and that value is generally referred to as the prototype of that object. So just the way we saw Bingo link to dog's prototype object, dog's prototype object is Bingo's prototype. So the double square brackets is ECMAScript's convention for naming internal slots and internal methods, right? So these are all objects. This is a function object, but they are basically they are all objects. So they all have internal slots, and internal slots are generally assigned when an object is created. Now this built-in function object has function.prototype as their prototype. So their prototype internal slot will be linked to function.prototype. Right? Their prototype internal slot will be, I don't know why I did not put these square brackets here, but their prototype internal slot will be linked to function.prototype because they are function objects, and all functions, whether built-in or user-defined, are instances of the built-in function object. So these built-in prototype objects, function.prototype, array.prototype, string.prototype, number.prototype, boolean, all of them, the rest of them that are not here, they all link to Object.prototype. Remember I said Object.prototype sits at the top of the prototype chain. So it's the final link on the prototype chain, and its own prototype, it has null as its own prototype. So these guys, function.prototype, array.prototype, if we had string number, they would all link to object.prototype. But Object.prototype has null as its own prototype because it is the final link on the prototype chain. So their internal slots will all link to Object.prototype here. Okay, let's bring in our dog and bingo. First, we have our dog constructor function here, and it's a function, right? So its prototype internal slot will be linked to function.prototype because it is a function. It is an instance of the built-in function. So its prototype internal slot will be linked to function.prototype. It has function.prototype as its own prototype. Now it's like dog's prototype object, on the other hand, is an object. The object that was created when dog was declared, right? It's an object. So its own prototype internal slot will be linked to object.prototype because it is an object. So let's bring in bingo. Now, when we invoked our dog function call with a new keyword, bingo was created, and dog.prototype was set as bingo's prototype. So bingo's prototype internal slot is linked to dog.prototype. That was how it was able to access that back property. Bingo has dog.prototype as its own prototype. Now we can see that not all objects link directly to object.prototype. They have a different object with a different set of default properties. For example, our dog function here, it's a function, so it links directly to function.prototype, and then function.prototype now links to object.prototype because dog is a function. Now, if we declare an array, that array will link to array.prototype. Array.prototype now links to object.prototype. If we declare an object, an empty object, or however, whatever syntax, if we declare an object, since it's an object, it will link directly to object.prototype. Another thing is, if you define an object that has a method or a property with the same name as its parent, the method or the property on the object will be returned. For example, if I define a back property on bingo, right? The value of the back property on bingo is what will be returned. It will shadow it will shadow the back property on bingo's prototype. So let's see, let bingo dot bark is equal to bingo is saying hi here. And I console log bingo dot, if I can spell, right? So the value of JavaScript, remember JavaScript first checks to see if a property with that name exists on the object itself. If it exists, it will return it. So bingo has a back property, it will return this one. It's also the same for the built-in arrays. Object.prototype has a built-in toString method, right? But array.prototype also has a built-in toString method. So if you call array.toString, the toString method that resides on the array.prototype is what will be returned. So we finally come to the end of this video, and if you understand what prototypes are and how objects are linked in JavaScript, and you have a basic, no matter how basic your understanding of prototypes are, then I think I did my job. If I try to make the concepts like really simple, but if there's still some areas that are not very clear, or things you don't understand, or questions you have, please leave them in the comment section and I will get to them. Give this video a thumbs up if you like it, subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you in the next one.